This is Common Ground with me, Sonja Wolf. In today's episode, we're going to talk about digital surveillance and immigration enforcement in the United States. And my guest today is Melissa Villa-Nicolas. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Information Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Her latest book is called Databorders, How Silicon Valley is Building an Industry Around Immigrants. Welcome, Melissa.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
April is usually the month when the Border Security Expo is taking place, this year in Phoenix, Arizona. The organizers of the Border Security Expo advertise this event as one of the largest and long-standing events of its kind, specifically what they call the border community. And by this, they mean government, law enforcement, and industry. And the idea of this event is to exchange ideas, expand networks, and experience new and developing technologies. Attendants of the expo will be able to see hands-on demonstrations of cutting-edge technology, from AI-driven surveillance tools to advanced detection systems. There will be more than 200 exhibitors this year, including Anduril Industries, the Department of Homeland Security, and U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Melissa, I invited you to talk a little bit about tech companies and also digital surveillance, specifically how digital surveillance is being used against Latino immigrants in the United States. The tech companies have long been associated with Silicon Valley. Many of the companies have relocated in recent years to Texas, but we still think very much of Silicon Valley as the birthplace of those tech companies. Could you tell us initially a little bit about how these companies use storytelling? What stories and myths do they tell to make themselves relatable to you citizens?
Sure. So, thank you for starting with that example on the Border Security Expo. I think it's a great example. So these companies tend to be related or coming out of Silicon Valley. They built oftentimes out of consumerism around tech in the US and internationally, but then they also hold contracts with the Department of Homeland Security. And so these companies built their sort of brand really around the storytelling of those companies aligned as the hero, this mythological hero in the United States. These companies often include Anduril, Palantir, Amazon, the list goes on and on. But essentially, those companies align themselves as this hero that's out to catch the bad guy along the US-Mexico border. And that bad guy is often an unnamed sort of shadow person, but the hints are usually around drug traffickers, sex trafficking, cartels, and it sort of casts a wide net of this trope of a bad guy, basically around anyone crossing at the US-Mexico border, and mostly Latinxes, but of course, today in the United States, we see, just anyone crossing through the US-Mexico border is hailed as sort of the criminal. So we have this binary setup between this hero, often the CEOs of tech companies, but they also create a culture around a hero that includes all of their workers and also includes Border Patrol and ICE. So anyone using their tech is sort of hailed as the hero that's capturing the bad guy, essentially the data and the physical location of folks crossing at the border or in the United States. That's sort of the groundwork of what they're working off of. And it's really, I think, what we launch from when we talk about Silicon Valley in the US-Mexico border is this mythology that these folks with the US government are doing sort of a hero's work.
There seem to be many tech companies out there. Could you give us some examples, perhaps, of the more prominent companies. Who's behind them and what kind of work are they doing?
Yeah, so there's so many examples. It can be difficult to keep track. There's Anduril, Palantir, Amazon. For us in information studies and librarianship, which sounds strange, but in the United States, even in the public sector or educational sectors, LexisNexis, Thomson Reuters, these companies that we came to trust as data holding companies, really that hold like the institutional knowledge of journals and public access to basically knowledge in higher education. Those companies also have contracts essentially with the Department of Homeland Security, which houses ICE. And so I can talk a little bit more about one in particular, which is Palantir. They really, in the early aughts, we started to see what was happening with their relationship to the Department of Homeland Security. Now, Palantir is a deeply Silicon Valley company that really came out of the location of Northern California and Silicon Valley. But they were immediately building commercial products, such as algorithms for companies to decide how they were going to market their products. And at the same time, holding contracts with the Department of Homeland Security to build products such as software databases and algorithms, essentially to police neighborhoods in the US and to build something called predictive policing, which is used in the United States. They would basically build out algorithms, sort of the fundamentals and the foundations of what we now call AI, to decide who was going to be policed, who was more likely to sort of commit a crime. And so for Palantir, that is their database called the Gotham database. And what came out in sort of 2010s was that Palantir had essentially built out databases for police in neighborhoods like Chicago and New Orleans to decide who they were going to essentially surveil and police, that the local law enforcement would use these algorithms to decide who to police. So that's really the groundwork that a company like Palantir has. And then they sort of move into the collaboration with Department of Homeland Security and ICE to build out more essentially algorithms and databases for policing, for sort of grabbing folks' data very quickly and essentially deciding who gets detained, deported, whose data they should sort of pull on to sort of watch in the US and along the US-Mexico border. That's a sort of classic example of a company from Silicon Valley with that really Silicon Valley culture becoming more of a Department of Defense type company. So bringing the sort of innovation from Silicon Valley and coupling it with the military defense of the Department of Defense and Department of Homeland Security. And essentially what we see now is really coming into fruition is having a very secure place with within the presidential office. So Palantir's co-founder, Peter Thiel, was actually one of the folks who hosted the presidential ball for President Trump in this past inauguration. So we can see these sort of companies, moving into place over the past 15 years and now really having a strong seat in the presidential cabinet, whether it's unofficial or not, as we see with Elon Musk. Another example, which is concerning for educators like myself, is LexisNexis, Thomson Reuters, Elsevier, because those companies have been established as companies that essentially hold licenses for databases. So when a faculty like myself publishes something, it goes into a journal, and then that journal might be housed by a certain database. And universities essentially have subscriptions to these different databases so that folks through the university can access that knowledge. For us in education, it's disconcerting because we might be using login information to access that data. But what has been found is that LexisNexis in particular has contracts with ICE. So while they should be a trusted company for especially lawyers and law students to access information about law, they also allow ICE to tap into their large repository of data to pull information about undocumented people. And what it does is it makes it so that educators and librarians, we can't guarantee that our patrons and our students are accessing educational information without giving compromising data to a company that has a contract with ICE. So that's a sort of long explanation of two different examples. LexisNexis, Elsevier, Thomson Reuters, these companies have a large of basically value as Google. So I do compare them to Silicon Valley companies because they're working with data and they have a huge net worth. And that I think is really important to understand, that they might be seen as like a tool for public education and public institutions in the United States, but their aim and their goals are very similar to Silicon Valley companies.
When you touched on the storytelling by the tech companies, you mentioned that the companies see themselves or portray themselves as heroes who make use of technology to protect American society against supposedly hostile actors. But to what extent is it true that technology is a force for the good? Is that necessarily the case, or do you find technology more problematic?
So this has definitely been debated among critical scholars of technology. There's one concept that stands out by Dr. Ruha Benjamin, a sort of critical writer of tech, which she calls it the new Jim Code. And this is that sort of our value as citizens around technology is often rooted in that it's going to lead to progress, that it's going to lead to something that's better for everyone overall. And so, at least in the United States, what we do is we allow these sort of predictive policing, the extreme policing of communities of color, in exchange for believing that there's some kind of a progressive outlet, that these technologies are going to lead to a more benevolent resolution. And we see that with these companies in particular. So with Anduril, I had followed Anduril Industries for years, which they sort of had their founding in Oculus. If the listeners or viewers are familiar with virtual reality goggles, Oculus really established the virtual reality goggle and introduced it into the public. And that establishment kind of went on to become Anduril Industries. When Anduril started, they were sort of pitching themselves as they're going to have these contracts with ICE. They're going to help build hardware and AI along the US-Mexico border. But they also had said within their mission statements and vision statements that they were going to help build predictive analytics for predicting when a fire might break out in California. Over the years, I had Anduril's mission statement change so often I had to sort of revise constantly. But what I found was there was always a kind of push-pull of like this benevolent reasoning that would give back to society in exchange for, these goals that were more debatable among the public. And so what we have to remember is that message of progress, that technology leads to progress, that technology is ultimately a force of good, that there's sort of an exchange happening, right? It's an exchange for heavier surveillance, especially around folks in communities of color or along the US-Mexico border.
In a moment, I'd like to turn to immigration policing and how digital surveillance affects immigrants in the United States. But it seems that the use of technology for immigration policing is not a recent invention, seems to build on the use of surveillance more generally in law enforcement. by police departments, also the Department of Homeland Security. Could you take us a little bit into the history of surveillance by law enforcement and also give us some examples? How has this technology been used in policing?
Yeah, so the US-Mexico border has a long sort of evolution of how technology has been used to engage surveillance or sort of move people throughout different parts of the borderlands. What I find interesting is that depending on the time frame, there's sort of a different fictional bad guy. So that more heavy surveillance and the more solidifying of the border in the US-Mexico border really happened around the Chinese Exclusion Act in the early 1900s, where more border patrol was being built up and more security is being built up around trying to exclude Chinese immigrants. So that's really where the sort of heavier distribution and sort of control of people came about. And then as we moved through the 1900s, of course, we had a lot of deportations with the Bracero program, where migrants from Mexico were invited to work in the United States and then were essentially deported in what was called Operation Wetback, which the Trump administration is drawing on right now as far as law and deporting people. So it really goes from different points in time and what the anxieties around immigration and who is immigrating to the U.S. One more sort of famous known use of surveillance is called sign cutting. That's essentially where Border Patrol is analyzing footprints in the U.S.-Mexico border, analyzing which way folks are going, and analyzing the sort of steps that people are taking, physical footprints that they're seeing. So there's a whole host of ways that folks are sort of surveilled and even moved around the US-Mexico border. And it's sort of what we have now and what I've written about my book, it builds onto that structure that was already in place. In the early 2000s, there was a proposal for the first, what was called virtual wall. And that was supposed to be done with more solidified defense companies such as Boeing. Boeing sort of took their pitch at it, and it was considered a failed project. The narrative for that is that the US-Mexico border is so unwieldy, it's heavily desert, it's too difficult to build a full structure of hardware along that border. And so it was considered this failed project that then Silicon Valley was asked to take up through the 2010s and really do the first Trump administration when they asked for pitches and bids on how to build tech along the US-Mexico border. So what's being built out now, AI, drones, different types of hardwares, virtual reality goggles, that builds on top of what Boeing and defense companies had already sort of put in place in the early 2000s.
Immigration policing is part of the Department of Homeland Security, and the DHS also has an investigative arm. So you mentioned predictive policing early on. I'd like to focus for a moment on what the Department of Homeland Security does. And I'm sure there have been many developments after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. So the Department of Homeland Security, but also police departments in what is more general law enforcement, seem to target communities of color, but also specific populations, gang members, for example. So this relates to databases, but also the law enforcement activities that are being conducted in the streets. Could you tell us a little bit more about this broader policing structure and the Department of Homeland Security?
Yeah, I mean, I really think of it as sort of hardwares and softwares. So There are certainly policing such as the Ring camera. A lot of folks might have a Ring camera from Amazon that even now lends data to the police. So depending on what city you're in, the police are allowed to access that data. So there's the hardware of surveillance, and then there's like the software, the data gathering, building out databases that lead to predictive policing, and even, of course, a very popular AI tech that is being developed more. But really, again, it's built on structures that were already in place. So you mentioned gang databases. One of the more popular examples is the Cal Gang database, and that was used in California in around 2016. And it's interesting because we think of these more progressive states, and so we have to remember that this technology is engaged in places like California. I think that's important to know because we kind of assume, the more progressive states will lead to more data privacy. So what folks found in around 2016 was that there was a database used essentially for predictive policing called the Cal Gang database. And what it would do was it would sort of automatically file Black and Latino names as potential gang members, Black and Latino boys who would become men, and depending on their zip code and other relevant data, that would predict that they were going to become gang members. This is just one example of how different bits of data lends itself to things like algorithmic policing, especially along the US-Mexico border. That Cal Gang database is also known, and these sort of algorithmic databases are also known for collecting what's called biodata. So tattoos of anyone that was arrested go into a database, essentially held as a system, and that those tattoos are kind of filed as gang tattoos. But biodata also includes retina scanning, fingerprint scanning. For me, what's disconcerting is DNA testing, which has been happening, going on maybe 10 years now. And as we recently found out, the DNA testing company 23andMe is going bankrupt, and essentially the ownership of the data is unknown. They're selling that data off. So it's concerning because 23andMe was one of a few DNA companies that essentially offered to bring immigrant families back together that had been displaced back in 2016. So these databases, they don't just necessarily store names, but they're really storing different types of biodata for predictive policing.
Let's return to the US-Mexico border. The United States has stepped up immigration enforcement at the border since the 1990s. And perhaps we can look for a moment at what the first Trump administration has done, followed by the Biden administration. So we remember the first Trump administration for the slogan, "Build the Wall." So there was very much this emphasis on the physical border. And many people, I think, perceived the Biden administration as more benign because it shifted away from this emphasis on the physical border. But at the same time, there was greater emphasis on the virtual border or the smart border. So initially, I wanted to ask you, how did the shift come about? How did the United States not necessarily move away from the physical border, but how did this emphasis on technology at the border come about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of there were a couple things happening that brought it to a critical mass. So they were scaffolding off of the different presidential administrations that had come before. President Barack Obama did have the highest number of deportations of all presidents. And then we go into President Trump, who was really advocating for a physical border wall and sort of even petitioning around that for popularity. So even through the first Trump administration, he had also been advocating for a virtual border wall. And that was a really popular idea, bipartisan among Democrats and Republicans, because it didn't have that sort of bad taste that a physical wall, the look of a physical wall, it didn't have that. But what they were being pitched is essentially that Silicon Valley could build just like, or even better than a physical wall, they could build a virtual wall. And in the sort of around 2015, Department of Homeland Security established an office in Silicon Valley. And essentially, they really pitched for a deeper relationship with Silicon Valley, an office that would build out innovation and more relationships with these companies. So Department of Homeland Security is sort of looking for something beyond their traditional relationships with defense companies like Boeing or Elbit. They were looking for more innovation that was coming out of these Silicon Valley companies. Those Silicon Valley companies were really, sort of really rolling out of their social media, like funds and the real buzz of this bigger sort of bubble of innovation that was happening with sort of every single thing that they could imagine at that time in Silicon Valley. So we have that come to a head and sort of come together through the pitch of the virtual border wall. And I do see the virtual border wall as like their launch of partnerships with Silicon Valley and the Department of Homeland Security. It's really where they saw that they could start to innovate new technology that would be beyond market consumerism. So we have companies, different companies pitching how they can sort of capture undocumented people in the borderlands. Some propose what's called a virtual wall that's going to be used with the technology that's the same technology as the 3D driving car, or the self-driving car. And that's a technology that's essentially a 3D technology that would build a 3D virtual wall so that it can kind of grab all of the data moving through the US-Mexico border, analyze it, tell Border Patrol if there's an object that's animal or a person, and then dispatch Border Patrol based on those analytics. So we have this sort of critical mass of Silicon Valley, essentially making billions off of their commercial products, and then proposing bids for contracts from the Department of Homeland Security. And that was really happening through like the 2015s, 2016s. When we get to the Biden administration, there's less deportations, but really like it's not necessarily about deportations, but what's being built in the background. They did try to propose an app called the BP1 app. It was supposed to be this app that immigrants in particular, could use to try to apply for citizenship. That got shut down probably on day one of this newer Trump presidency. But it didn't necessarily promise data privacy or security, which is sort of my pitch of what needs to be done. Is these products need to actually guarantee data privacy for undocumented people, refugees, any folks that are applying for different statuses of immigration. So yeah, we have through the Biden era an app that is supposed to be more friendly towards immigrants waiting to cross the border or that are crossing. But at the same time, what we've found out now is that the Biden administration also like low-key had places like Guantanamo. They through the Obama administration had supposedly closed down Guantanamo, but really the Biden administration had kept Guantanamo open and has had contracts with private prisons around Guantanamo. So this sort of seamlessly moves into the Trump administration as these scaffolds build.
You live in California. What is your personal experience of how the authorities use technology in the borderlands?
Yeah. So I grew up here. I'm second generation Mexican American. So my grandparents came from Chihuahua. But really, when growing up in Riverside County, which is sort of one county away from the Tijuana border crossing, we see Border Patrol in our everyday lives. There's a border detention center in my hometown. There's a border checkpoint that we're always familiar with. There's multiple border checkpoints between San Diego and LA. And then there's just always a Border Patrol car parked on the freeway, even now. The border checkpoint, it used to be much more congested growing up. And so I did grow up seeing them sort of grill my mom on her citizenship as we were just coming from San Diego back to Riverside. It's not okay that it's naturalized, but to me, what is more important is that we can visibly see that. It's much harder to get in to see what's going on in border detention centers. But for me, what is interesting and disconcerting is that we don't always know how data moves and what I call databorders. We don't know how Border Patrol now decides who they're going to pull over. Growing up in the past, you just wait in line to get through these border checkpoints, much like crossing into Mexico or crossing back, you wait in line. But now with technology like license plate readers, there's sort of more of like identification of who's going to be pulled over. My sort of concern is that as a citizen, we don't know how information and data is moving because it's considered private property of these companies. The data, the algorithms, even though there's contracts with the government, very few behind the scenes databases have been leaked. It's essentially considered property of those companies. So I think that there's this deep relationship between the physical border that those of us who grew up in the borderlands were quite accustomed to, and the way that technology moves people quickly through checkpoints, or folks might be pulled over through facial recognition, through all kinds of different ways. My concern is that we don't get to know how predictive policing is working.
The key concept in your book is data borders. What is this concept meant to convey, and how have these data borders expanded in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, what I hope folks will have is more of an effective relationship to these companies that we use. So when we're purchasing on Amazon is basically the reason that this whole sort of network can exist, because they essentially hold the cloud. So the Amazon cloud is what holds data for ICE and the Department of Homeland Security. In order to have these major projects, you need a lot of data storage. And that's essentially the role that Amazon plays, is the data storage. So in every part of our lives, I do think we're networked in to what I call data borders. Unfortunately for us in the US Post Office holds contracts with Clearview. That's a Silicon Valley company that is sort of notorious for just taking facial recognition scans. They hold a larger database of facial recognition scans than the FBI in the United States. So the US Postal Office has a contract with Clearview. There's just all of these entrances into this relationship between ICE, Department of Homeland Security, and Silicon Valley that we may or may not know we're entering as we move about our day. We may not have necessarily given consent to that. And so that, for me, is data borders. That, especially when I described my relationship to the physical borderland, right? Like, I've had family migrate from Mexico, but I've seen my mom surveilled, essentially, her citizenship question. Of course, I grew up knowing people that were deported or detained. And that's my relationship to the physical borderland. I don't think that there's many people I could say, I think that most citizens in the US need to know that they have essentially a relationship to data borderlands.
So it seems that digital surveillance in the United States practically affects anyone, and that people are not necessarily aware of how data they share unknowingly in many different contexts gets networked or is being used by these tech companies and later also shared with the authorities. And so I was interested in this idea of data correlation that is behind digital surveillance. So in the case of undocumented immigrants who we might assume are perhaps more cautious about how they share information, but even so, the authorities have ways of tracking undocumented immigrants. Could you explain what is behind this idea of data correlation and how can it affect undocumented immigrants?
Sure. So when I first went to graduate school in information science, I saw the sort of bones being built of what became algorithms. I was going to school in a department where folks were really building like what would become big data and algorithms. And what I came to understand was that data, you can't build prediction or algorithms without a lot of data. You need a lot of data to build things like AI. So essentially, when you're building out an algorithm, if you have, say, a house in a rural location without a street address, if you have a person without data, you build that data point by correlation, by the data points around that. And so what we found through the 2010s, probably starting over 10 years ago, were deportations were changing. People were being located at places that they couldn't have been located without surveillance. And essentially, they were being found even through their social media networks and contacts. And so that's why I think it's important to understand sort of correlation, because my data, even if I have US citizenship, it's not so much about just me being a point of contact for an undocumented person. It's about all of my data being lent into these systems to build out predictions and AI. You need a lot of data to build AI. AI likes to scrape a lot of data, right? To build out answers, to build out prediction. So I think even just as lending ourselves as a point of contact for LexisNexis, for Amazon, for Palantir, for Anduril, whether we want to or not, we're just a sort of drop in the bucket on how prediction is going to happen. One example, again, is LexisNexis. So LexisNexis, you can go to their website, you can ask for your data ID packet. It does for US citizens and folks in the US with different types of citizenship. It does require an ID number. So that might be like a license number, an ID number, social security number, and a name. So there's a little bit of hesitation and privilege that comes with it. Are you okay with like flagging yourself to see your own data? But when I did that, I got 70 pages of my personal data. And that's essentially what LexisNexis sells off as a data company. But what they've gathered over time, right, through scraping the internet, through myself sort of opting in to giving over information for different reasons. I got 70 pages of where I've lived, of just a lot of folks that were connected to me. And that's just my data packet. And I believe it's if you're in California, you can also opt out from LexisNexis to own your data and sort of your data package. But what we've also found is that an individual's data, it's really not valued as much. It's a couple cents. It's those huge packets of data that are bought and sold. That's the large value. So that's what I'm saying with correlation, that these systems based in databases, algorithms, predictive policing, AI, they can't necessarily exist. They can't locate a sort of data sink, a person without certain data, without those other networks of data around them. And I think that's why it's important for us to understand as individuals how we're networked in, how we give these systems value.
Immigration is one of the main issues on the agenda of the second Trump administration. And we have already seen in news coverage how immigration agents try to target, to arrest undocumented immigrants in certain places, courthouses, perhaps workplaces. So how is it that this technology can be used to track down immigrants in those places?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it can be used through social media. It can be used through facial recognition software. I think what's interesting, so right now where we're at in the United States is that the Trump administration is essentially fining universities a lot of money for the way they handled the protests last year for Palestine. And part of the fine is essentially the Trump administration telling these universities, you adhere to our guidelines or you lose these federal funds, millions in federal funds. One of those stipulations for guidelines is that students are no longer allowed to wear face masks at all in protest, but at all. Now, of course, this is interesting because we had COVID very recently. So folks should have the right to use face masks for their own safety. But it's essentially, there's no denying that it's because of facial recognition software, because that actually does mask against facial recognition software. And what we're seeing in the US right now is that students on visas, students that are immigrants at colleges and universities are being threatened with removal and deportation based on their participation in those protests. So, yeah, I think that immigrants especially are in danger of essentially being located through facial recognition. And that's where we see the threat of, don't mask your face because we need to be able to locate you. So that's just one example. And that's just come to a head in the past couple months. Over the past years, folks have been located through social media data. If you look at people can look at the Gotham database because it was leaked through a FOIA years ago. So if you look at the Gotham database, like sort of the inner workings of it, you can see how it grabs through different information, social media data, and that's how police are able to use that to locate someone. There's different entrances into how to locate people by way of their data. There's just a lot there, and it's disconcerting to say the least. But I do think that the fact that the Trump administration is threatened with masks, I think it shows how valuable data is, biodata and just information. But I think it means that there's ways to keep our data private and to advocate for that, of course.
As we're nearing the end of the episode, I would like to talk a little bit about resistance to digital surveillance. So looking again at the second Trump administration, what we see is that several of the tech billionaires have sought a closer relationship with the Trump administration. So this is a government that essentially is opening its door to the tech companies. And so you argue, for example, for a greater data privacy. Perhaps in these moments, policymakers themselves are not the best individuals to look to if we want to promote greater data privacy, for example. So if we think a little bit about how the tech companies might be reined in, or how people in the United States, including immigrants, might protect or try to protect their data a little bit more, what sort of ideas would you propose?
I think there's a lot of avenues into this. We do see immigrant rights groups taking on data privacy as sort of a new part of immigrant rights. So following groups like Mahente and there's a lot of different groups at this point. National Immigration Project. For us in education, there's a group called Library Freedom Project. There's Electronic Frontier Foundation. So I think it's important first to have your network that you can follow along with, or these groups even have sort of courses that you can go through to understand how to advocate for data rights. In the university systems and some university systems right now, we are undergoing a lot of training on know your rights. So if our students that are immigrants, if ICE comes to campus and threatens our students that are immigrants, what do we do? Like, we need to follow the procedure of know your rights so that we can protect our students and immediately invoke legal aid for those folks. So I think just being really educated on know your rights training is important. I think there's individual data privacy that we can follow and build out as part of those know your rights trainings. So for immigrant centers and organizations, immigrant rights organizations, to sort of integrate data privacy more into those know your rights trainings, I think is really important. And that becomes important for even faculty in the United States, because faculty on work visas are being detained and threatened. So following your own personal data privacy procedure is important. Unfortunately, what we're finding is faculty's computers are being apprehended at the border. That I talked about in the book, but that has been sort of legal since the 2010s, since the first Trump administration, that anywhere that's 100 miles from a border, including the ocean, someone's technology can be seized and looked through. So unfortunately, professors are finding that when they travel to conferences internationally and they come back, their computers are being looked through. So again, I think I don't want to put it all on individual responsibility, because I do really believe in policy. I do believe in a better, more perfect outlook. Antitrust is important, that these companies don't hold such large monopolies. We've really been building towards these companies holding way too much for themselves. So I do believe in sort of a better outlook, that we advocate for policy first and not just put it on individuals or individual immigrants to have to protect their data, that there's more of a opt-in sort of relationship to technology, where we'd have to opt in to our data being sold rather than opt out. So like the example I gave earlier, Clearview AI, they've just sort of scraped facial recognition and gathered face scans without permission, without folks' permissions. So an opt-in model where our data isn't just gathered and then they sort of apologize and get sued after. And then I believe ultimately, because undocumented people are the targets and the sort of data value here, I really do believe that we should build policy around what undocumented people want. I know that's sort of in the best case scenario, but many immigrants that have come here have experienced intense surveillance technologies. Folks that have been detained in detention centers are highly aware of the technologies used there. So I do think those are the best folks to lend their voice on how we should build out data privacy. I know it's sort of like my utopian scenario, but I do think if you look at the literature specifically from like Chicano studies, Latino studies, on folks that have worked in electronics manufacturing, especially Mexican women along the US-Mexico border, have worked in electronics manufacturing for decades. their number one concern was environmental damage and that they were seen directly coming out of those factories. So if we listen to them, then we know that we get to this point where AI, one question from AI uses like however many gallons of water. We would know if we could just go back and listen to those folks, what's going to happen. So I really do think prioritizing the folks that have had the most intense relationship to surveillance technology would build out the best data policy.
Melissa, thank you very much for sitting down with me to talk about digital surveillance and immigration enforcement in the United States. That was Melissa Villa-Nicolas, information studies scholar, here on Common Ground with me, Sonja Wolf. Thank you.
Thank you.